All right. Thanks everybody for joining today. It looks like we have a fantastic participation. And so everybody knows, we sent this invite to some of our clients in Ontario, to the general dairy farmers of PI and dairy farmers of Newfoundland and Labrador membership. So we're going to have a wide spectrum of participants from Eastern Canada. And the topic, as we all are aware, is the palmitic acid, feeding palmitic acid, the insights, questions and answers. So I want to take some time just to talk about the science around it and some of my experiences and anecdotal evidence that we've had feeding it. So if you can just hold tight here, I'm going to try to Okay, here we go. Okay, so interesting week. Started a couple weeks ago. I guess our industry, as everybody knows, was profiled by a misinformed critic. Our feed-in strategies were questioned, despite the fact that everything we feed our cows is approved by CFIA. We've been doing a lot of these feeding practices for well over a decade, sometimes 2-3 decades. And the other thing too that we got to take into account is that this is milk that we all consume ourselves. We feed it to our own families. We care a lot about what comes out of that cow because it affects not only the public but our own families and our own children. So it's a very close issue to many of us. All right. And as we know, there's a lot of things that have been talked about over the past week that we question as producers, as myself as a scientist. We don't like it when there's misinformed public because we're, obviously they can make decisions with that information. So just advancing the slides here. So the topics that I want to go through today are a quick walkthrough of Palm Plantation. I think many of us that have maybe traveled to the south have seen palm trees before, but it takes a trip to Asia to see what an actual palm plantation looks like. I've been there many times visiting palm farms. So I have a lot of photographs and I'll show you a few today just so that everybody can have a good understanding where the stuff comes from. And pardon me, the other thing that I want to explain is what is palmitic acid and how is it different than palm oil? Those two things are not the same. How is butterfat affected by feeding these fats? And a few tips on helping consumers understand around our feeding practices. And finally, we're going to end the conversation by looking at alternatives to feeding palm-based supplements and maximizing the butterfat with the diet through other means. And then we have some questions and answers throughout. Again, feel free to add your questions and answers in the or questions and comments actually in the chat window. Some of these will be just on audio. Zoom has the option to call in with your phone. I see there's a few people on today, so you can reach out to myself or Amber Craswell if you want a copy of the slides. We will be doing this presentation again as well, so if you want to see it again, you can reach out. This is a really brief summary of what I used for research on this presentation today. There's many more studies that I could add to this, but these are the three main ones. There's a French group that did studies on the effect of fatty acids and that you feed and what ends up in the milk, and that was published back in 2000. Adam Locke, most recently, I think many of you may have seen this excellent 24-minute video that was on Buttergate, discussions and thoughts around it. And you can find that on this link here. Again, follow up with us after if you want these notes. It was just published, and he did a very thorough very quick but thorough look into what affects butterfat. And finally, this is a study that I'll refer to through the presentation. It was a study done by O'Donnell and company back in 2010. And that's a survey of all the milk composition of US retail products based on label claims, and how the different production practices that are on the farms in the United States affect the actual butterfat content of that milk. So super interesting stuff for me as a science geek. What got us to this point? Well, back in, I think it was back in the, just backing up way, let's talk about 1980, 1990. At that point, dietitians were recommending the use of plant-based oils in our foods. Pardon me, because of the link of saturated fat to heart disease. And we know that science since then has shown that there's less of a link than what they were led to believe in the 80s and 90s. And as a result, people started to appreciate butter again because of its wonderful flavor and less concerns about the consumption of saturated fatty acids. I think my wife is a dietitian. She works at the hospital here in Kentville, Nova Scotia. And I think, among her group too, I think it's the general consensus is that there's no problem eating low amounts of any oil. I think it's the problem is when you have excessive consumption of a lot of fats in your diet, and that may lead to just some of the health problems that we see. But eating butter has certainly been advocated as being a healthy choice, and I don't see any reason that should be different. This came about around the same time that magazine article that was published in 2014 at Time, when butter consumption was on the rise. You can see here this chart. It shows us that there's a rapid increase in butter production by year in Canada. Clearly we've had a population increase over that same amount of time, but the per capita consumption has been increasing. Unfortunately, I don't have the 2020 data here, but I'm sure it's as higher as what it was in 2019. So very interesting. Like I said, one of the first things I want to talk about today is palm. Where does palmitic acid come from, and really what is the composition of it? How is it made? And we'll touch on that so that you can help consumers understand if they are asking questions about what we feed our cows. This is somewhat of an autobiography of my past 11 years too. We've been in this business of nutrition consultant for over 15 years. And about 11 years ago, we started to represent a fatty acid product, which many of you have fed or are aware of, called Energizer RP10. And it's not only something that I appreciate as being part of my business, but it's a farming sector that I've really taken a lot of, interest in how they produce it and what the environmental story is around it. And that's what I hope to share today very briefly. So this is typical. Sort of palm plantations are 25, 30 years old before they replant them. Most palm plantations in Malaysia are replanted after they become unproductive. So what you see here is a very old palm plantation. You can tell, I guess, this tree right here that my mouse is on is a younger tree because it still has those fronds. As it gets older, the tree actually looks more like this one here in the background, where it's a straighter, sort of less rough. So I think that many of you know that these are farmed, these are like a forest farm. And what I'm showing you here on this map here is just a cross section of where palm does grow well, and it's a plant that grows very well around the equator. So therefore, that's why it's so heavily produced in Malaysia and Indonesia, and that's where the majority of palm is produced. can see across Africa and in parts of Asia, there is ideal conditions as well. But we're going to focus on Malaysia today. That's where Energizer RP10 and most other fats would come from that we're actually feeding our cows. Like I said, it's 25-30 year production cycle. This would be an example of a young plantation in the background, and then a new planting of palm trees that I believe this would only be planted probably that same year. It might only be less than a year old in this case here. You can see the farming practices are row crop. There's, one thing I wanted to highlight is that when palm trees are planted, these are typically going onto land that was previously a palm plantation, or it was a idle land, or it was another crop that they were switching away from. For example, rubber plantation could have been before. Palm trees have been planted in Malaysia since the late 1800s. It was brought over by, of course, Malaysia being a British colony at one point, it was brought over by the British as an ornamental crop, and they in the early 1900s they decided to farm it because of its high oil production per tree. The palm is actually harvested from these fresh fruit bunches. You can see it's every single fresh fruit bunch is harvested by hand. You can see that's where this gentleman here cut off the FFB, or fresh fruit bunch, and each one of these little seeds here that you see contains a significant amount of oil content. Inside that, there's also a palm kernel, which is also pressed into a different stream of oil. But the main oil that comes from these trees, about 80 to 85% of the yield is palm oil, and the rest is palm kernel oil. Now, when these little seeds are crushed, not only do we get oil, but we also get this feed called PKE, or palm kernel expeller. And that's a fibrous feed. It's not used in Canada because it's simply too far to ship the PKE. It's used more in countries like New Zealand, Australia, and Southeast Asia in lactating cattle diets. And that type of feed is actually, again, just a byproduct of the palm production. By no means are these, or one thing I want to talk about today too, is that by no means are these trees being planted for animal feed. These trees are being primarily used for human food, industrial, and other chemical applications. And I'll explain in a moment what our yield of feed is from these. The fresh fruit bunches are brought over to a collection area, and you can see that, show you this video quickly here. You can see it's harvested simply. This is a friend we had. Be careful. Okay. Like this? He eventually gets it. And these fruit bunches are brought into a collection area and put onto these trucks that are brought over to what we call a crushing plant, where the crude palm oil is crushed from the seeds. And the other thing I want to highlight here is just the enormous amount of people that work in this sector in Malaysia. This is a photograph I took when I was over around 5 or 6 years ago, visiting these palm farms, and you can see the industry is a very human resource based industry. A lot of work is still being done by hand, and the Malaysia people, which are made up of 3 different cultures primarily, work together in this industry, and they've I don't know what percent of the country's wealth is from palm, but it's certainly significant. From there, this is just I'll show you the rest of this in terms of what the supply chain looks like. We start up here in the top left where the plantation, the fresh fruit bunches are milled in a crushing plant. And then after the crushing plant, it goes into a refinery, and that's where it's cleaned up. It's filtered out. It's clarified, very similar to what we do with canola or soybean oil. And then it's fractionated into a few different components. And the main component from palm oil is Olan. It's around 70, I don't know why it says 80% there. I think it's closer to 70% of what that crude palm oil is Olan. And Olan is, as you guessed it, used in human food. It's a cooking oil used in many countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and many other Asian countries. They use it the same way we would soy or canola here in Canada. They also use it as a spread. Now, the stearin portion, which is closer to 30% or more, would then be used for many, many other uses. In some cases, food, as you see by this chart here, it can be used in margarine. And that's where these sort of so-called unhealthy margarines might come from, is just from stearin, because they get modified. And that's a big difference. A modified fat that is something we use in biscuits and margarine and things like that. And those are high in trans fats, which are hard on human health. Trans fats have been talked about for a couple decades as being something we should consume very little of. So that, unfortunately, is what Canadians may be thinking of when they hear about palm being fed to cows, is they think that it could be related to the the hydrogenated oils that people are told not to consume. So that's one thing too I want to say, is that there's a big difference between the palm fat that is going into Energizer RP10 versus what is going into hydrogenation and being used in these unhealthy foods. Now, this is the factory. Essentially we pour the Energizer over this cold drum, and then it's flaked off, and can't show you anymore. It's top secret. So goes also into, after flaking, goes into this bagging system, and it's then weighed into these 25 kg bags. As you can see, it's a pretty manual production line here. And then one day somebody called in sick, so they called me in to help with the bagging operation. And it was probably one of the most unproductive days they had at that facility. So after lifting one or two bags, my back was hurting, and I had to tour the warehouse where this fat is stored after production for up to a week, where it's cooled. The condensation comes off of it because it's a very warm climate there. It's usually low 30s for temperature and 90 or 100% humidity. So that's part of the reason why it's difficult to work on a production line there too. So, one thing I want to highlight too is just going back here for a moment. That fresh fruit bunch that we see in this picture, palm oil generally yields about 2 tons per year per acre. Energizer RP10 yield from 2 tons of this palm oil is only 6 bags. When we worked out what the percentage of that specific fatty acid that would go into Energizer, it only works out to about 6 bags per acre per year. The vast majority of that palm oil is used in human food. And it's a very important dietary food. Now, these trees are not grown for animal feed. These trees are grown for human food and other purposes. There's currently 11. One of the questions that I've, given a lot of thought to in my own mind, as somebody who represents, the palm industry to some extent, I guess. And one thing that I've actually, paused and thought about a lot and read a lot about and tried to inform myself is about the sustainability of this feed. So the question is that we get, we're currently seeing this in media. The question is palm sustainable feed? I think many people have made the decision already that they believe it's not. But what I want to show you today is a few facts around it, because this is the type of information I think we can help our consumers when they're trying to decide what to think about all this. There's 11 million acres of palm planted in Malaysia. And let's compare that to Canada for a moment. There's 20 million acres of canola produced in Canada per year, and that's going up in a linear fashion every year. When you fly over Saskatchewan and Manitoba on a June or July day, about a third of the fields are yellow, beautiful yellow fields. It looks like a checkerboard out there. When you fly over Malaysia, a lot less of Malaysia is palm than what we have as canola in Canada. 11 million acres. Currently, 56% of Malaysia is forest, parks, wildlife, and nature reserves. And the country of Malaysia is very aware that that's important to their ecosystem. They're doing what they can to maintain that greater than 50% of the land is forest, parks, wild, and nature reserves. And I think as global citizens, we recognize the importance of maintaining that as well. When they expand a plantation, again, that's on idle land. It replaces other crops in many cases. The carbon sink of plantations is shown to be near what a rainforest would be. The other thing to consider is that of all the oil seeds that we consume in our human diet, the palm oil is 10 times more productive per acre than comparing it to soybeans, for example. In palm, we get greater than 2 tons of oil yield per year per acre. And soybean is in a really good yielding year. And I know many of you guys on this call might be soybean farmers. I would say on like an awesome yield might be 2 tons of beans per acre. In Nova Scotia, we've seen, a good yield is probably more like 1.5 tons or less. But when you multiply that out, we're only getting 200 to 300 kgs of oil per acre. So the world is obviously hungry for vegetable oil, for food. So when we question what the sustainability of palm, it's only fair to look at compared to all other all other oil sources in our diet, and take a pragmatic look at what is going to actually truly be the most efficient. And I think if we look at palm, it is highly efficient per acre. Again, the feeds are made from byproduct stocks. We don't use food. We don't feed palm oil to cows, period. It's one thing that we should remind our consumers of. If they say, why do you feed palm oil? We don't feed palm oil to our cows, period. And then they may bring up something else in the conversation, but the point being, we do not feed palm oil to our cows. We feed these byproducts that is otherwise not used in food. If it's not used in feed, it's going to probably be burned as used in biofuel production or some other downstream co-product. We use feed from byproducts of palm. We definitely don't use palm oil in dairy diets. There is also a strong sustainability organization in Malaysia called the Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil, and that has many tiers to it. A few of them being the environmental responsibility around producing palm trees, human labor and the way workers are treated, and also just the replanting and the control it has over limiting the use of rainforest for the production of palm. IFCO, the company that manufactures our products that many of you guys on this call actually feed, is a member of the RSPO. A few more things here. When we look at land use around the world, oil palm is 7%. Soybeans is 5-6 times more than what we have as palm oil, and it's even higher than oil palm is even less acreage than rapeseed or what we call in Canada is canola meal. So The annual yields per hectare are far, like I said, are far higher on palm oil than any other. So if we're looking at the best use of an acre of land on our globe for oil production, then we seriously have to question what oil seed we want to focus on. And now, simply what I want to show you here is not to go into too much detail, but a lot of the use of palm oil is in food industry: biscuits, cakes, chips, chocolate, cooking oil, ice cream even. Yeah, I know that's not good that they use it in ice cream, but it's there. And of course, we all know they use it in the infamous margarine, mayonnaise, pastry, snacks, others. So Canadians are consuming a lot of these products. It's palm is in everybody's diet. I think somebody on Facebook the other day said that they looked at their cupboard, and greater than 50% of their cupboard had of their pantry had palm ingredients in it. Okay, palm oil is not going to go away. If there's co-products we can use from this industry, then that's, I think, something that we should continue to use. Palm oil is not fed to cows. Let's get a little more into the dairy cow portion of this presentation, and you can see that this is a really brief slide of what the main fatty acid composition of fats is. So this is just plain palm oil, crude palm oil, and you can see just the reason why palm oil is used in many industries is because of that palm oil, the palmitic acid content that it has in the oleic. So a lot of the oleic goes into human food and in the form of olein. And you can see that palm oil has a similar fatty acid profile to this old product we used to feed a lot of in Canada called Magalac. So Magalac is also a product that we fed for the past 30 years that is based off of palm oil byproducts, specifically PFAD, or palm fatty acid distillate. It's a very common, there's a heavy amount of that produced, and we found 30 years ago that made an excellent animal feed when you make a salt out of it. Even products like that are affected by this DFC statement. Energizer RP10 is in this classification of fats that we call palmitic enriched, and you can see that it has high levels of palmitic acid. It also has a little bit of oleic acid, which is helpful in the digestibility of that fat. So when you do look for this is not an advertisement by any means, but when you do look for palm feeds to feed your cow, when we get to that point when it's cool to feed it again, the oleic acid is one thing that you want to have in there, is because it helps digestibility of the diet. Just a reminder, if anybody has a comment, question, just put it into the window there. And as Jeanette McDonald said, Jeffo Dairy Fat is RSPO member, or is RSPO as well. Yes, they're the company that they source from is an RSPO member. That's correct. What products include palm? So what is affected by this DFC statement that requests us to temporarily consider removing palm fats from the diets of cattle? There's a lot of good products that are on the line here. This whole category of palmitic and enriched fats that we feed in Canada are on the line. Energizer, Enervive, Jeffo Dairy Fat, Adipalm. There's many others I can add to that list. The blends, like this new one they're coming out with, Olay, sometime in the summer, is also affected by this. And many of the old classic calcium salts, I think many of us have probably fed Magalac in the past, Inertia, Jeffo have one called CalciFat. These are all products that are, they don't include crude, do not include palm oil in them, but they are co-products or byproducts of the palm oil industry. And that is very concerning that we've lost these tools temporarily. Now, very briefly, I think a lot of you know this already. How does feeding C16, which is also palmitic acid, or Energizer RP10, the brand name, how does that affect cow performance? And this is a study that Adam Locke presented actually on that live webinar he did last week, and it's based off of 20 studies that Adam Locke and his students looked at in this research. They concluded the same thing that many farmers have told me for the past 10 years, is that it doesn't really affect intake when you feed an energizer, but it does improve the milk yield in some cases, especially early lactation cows, and improves the fat-corrected milk significantly, 2.4 kgs on average. And this is across 19 studies, all right? This is what was a meta-analysis that's being written right now for submission to the Journal of Dairy Science, and improves the energy-corrected milk. Now, anecdotally, what I hear from farmers when after a week after they begin to feed a product like Energizer RP10 is that they see a fairly rapid increase in butterfat percent, and generally what we call a transfer rate of about 30%. So when you feed a bag of fat, generally you're getting about 7 or 8 kgs more butterfat from that herd. So if you feed 100 cows a bag of Energizer, then you end up getting about 7 or 8 kgs more butterfat production because of the energy content of this feed. There's many other ways to get 7 or 8 kgs of butterfat from a cow too. And we're focused on that a little bit later in the presentation. Folks also say that they, especially over the past 2 weeks, what I've heard is that in a lot of cases right now, people are over quota. They don't feed a product like Energizer just to have a butterfat bonus. But one of the most unfortunate things we're going to miss with feeding this stuff is that it helps, people tell me it helps conception and body condition. So now there is ways to replace that in the diet with other fats that we'll get to, where you can still maintain some of those benefits. It's very difficult to find a single ingredient that's going to provide all the benefits so that the Energizer is, or any other palmitic enriched fatty acid. One of the big questions that I got back from when I asked people what they want in this presentation today to be answered is, how does palmitic acid affect milk fat? And the answer has been well studied. There's plenty of data that shows what palmitic acid does to milk fat. Firstly, the main thing is that it increases the palmitic acid content of the milk fat. So generally, for example, in this study here, a diet that was low in fat or had no fat at all had about 32% palmitic acid in the butterfat. And when you feed a mixed product like a calcium salt, like Magaloc or Jeffocalcifat or something like that, you get a slight increase in C16. But when you feed a palmitic acid enriched fat like Energizer or something like that, you get a more significant increase in palmitic acid content. Okay, so let's recognize that there is an increase in palmitic acid content of the butterfat, and that's because the mammary gland is building more of the triglycerides with the palmitic acid that's circulating in that cow. What we do see as well is a decrease in many of these other saturated fatty acids in the milk. At the same time, the C6 through to the C14 all go down significantly. You can see here, this is the significance here, very significant decrease in other saturated fatty acids in the milk. So generally, we get an increase in palmitic acid in the butterfat when we feed these, and we get a decrease in a lot of these other saturated fats that are in the milk. Right? Not a big impact on the oleic acid, which is the other primary fatty acid in milk. Now, to my knowledge, there is no data, no scientific data that suggests that this affects butter hardness. There is no science that I'm aware of that shows that feeding this, that having a higher palmitic acid content in the butterfat affects the processing properties of butter. So the question is, are there other factors that affect palmitic acid and milk fat as well? And there certainly is. And one of the documents that I studied this past weekend was out of the US, where they analyzed milk fats from different types of milks, for example, grass-based, organic, and conventional. And that study showed that grass-based cartons of milk that were labeled as grass-based diets had higher levels of palmitic acid in the milk. So that makes sense. Grass-based diets like pasture or high levels of, say, timothy, fescue, reed canary grass, they have a lot of fatty acids. And that cow converts the fatty acids into palmitic acid that ends up in the butterfat. Also, organic milk has been shown to have higher contents of palmitic acid. So when a professor has a bar of organic butter and a bar of conventional butter, and he tries to demonstrate how well that melts on a piece of toast, I'm not sure if it's realized that the organic milk actually has a higher content of palmitic acid than a conventional produced milk fat. So the palmitic supplemented cows obviously have a higher level of palmitic acid and butterfat as well. So now, how do we get lower palmitic acid and butterfat? If that was ever something we actually wanted to do, and generally we'd have to feed the cow a very low fat diet. We'd have to feed her a diet that's only 3.5% fat. And that means very little use of oil seed meals that have fats in them. No use of protected fats or supplemental fats, no use of tallow. A low fat diet will give low levels of palmitic acid and butterfat, and also a low forage, high grain diet. These are all things that we tend to shy away of in Canada because we know a low forage, high grain diet can lead to a higher risk of ruminal acidosis. So it's not something we definitely want to go to, nor do we want to consider going to lower palmitic acid and butterfat if we really have little control over it. The cow is ultimately the one that has the most control over the amount of palmitic acid that ends up in that butterfat. The cow's mission in life is to get that lipid to flow out of her teat into the suckling calf's mouth. And the biological rationale behind that is she has to feed her young. Anytime that a milk fat, so the cow, I guess, let me re-say this in a different way. To the cow, she has to maintain fluidity in that milk fat, or else it will not come out of the udder or the teat. It would obviously coagulate or be hard before it comes out, and that would be a problem. Biologically, cows adapt. They use different fatty acids that are in their diet and adjust them on that triglyceride so that the milk fat will flow out of that teat into the suckling calf's mouth. And that's what Adam Locke has tried to say in his presentation as well, is that the cow has the most control over that through her own homeostasis. Now, what affects butter hardness? By no means am I a butter expert, although it is kind of interesting. I've learned a lot about it the past 2 weeks, and I think it is something that would be pretty fun to play around with more in our own home kitchen. But first of all, primarily melting point. So the amount of saturated fat content may affect it. Okay, and we know the cow is to maintain fluidity of that butter fat, she's putting certain fatty acids into that milk so that it maintains fluidity. So the cow has the most control over that, not us as a nutritionist or you as a farmer. The storage temperature, I mean, clearly we know that if, this time of year, when especially yesterday and today, and on the East Coast here, it's been it's wicked cold. So butter that's in a house that's only 17 or 18 Celsius, it's gonna be really cold. When my mother visits, the house ends up being about 24 or 25 Celsius. So the butter's, it's very spreadable at that temperature. But the other thing too is a lot of Canadians put their butter into a shelf that's on the exterior wall. And that shelf, if you grew up in a farmhouse that I did, that shelf could be closer to like 10 degrees probably inside that cupboard. So that's definitely those are the obvious things. And joking aside, I mean, that's probably a lot of it. Now, there's many things in processing that can also impact butter hardness. And again, I'm not an expert, but I did, through my research, find that it's well documented in research that the temperature of that cream at aging and also the cream churn agitation speed impart different butter textures. So it is certainly something that can be controlled by processing. All right. Again, if you have any questions, go ahead, just put it in the chat window there. There's one of the people on the call just on the webinar this morning says there's a recommendation, but no actual ban on reducing palm-based feeds. So if we want to continue to feed RP10, we can. I mean, I've read the same thing you guys have, so I interpret it as a request to remove it from the diets. So that is the DFC statement specifically. What contributes to C16 in a diet? Okay, so what we have here is a fancy little graph that shows where all the C16 comes from in a diet that has no fat. All right, so you can see a large portion of this C16 in a diet comes from forages and grains. In this case here, in this farm, it's first cut, third cut, corn silage, high moisture corn snaplage, and corn grain. You can see about 90% of that diet's C16. So there's all of our feed ingredients have C16 in it already. All right, with the exception of obviously mineral and stuff like that. Now, when we add a product like RP10 in there at a significant level, say a level that you feed during the summer time or something like that, like 500 grams or 450 grams per cow per day, you can see a significant amount of the palmitic acid contribution to the diet suddenly becomes that fatty acid that we're feeding, in this case, Energizer. But all these other feeds are still contributing a significant amount of C16. So C16 is in feed ingredients already. If we remove palmitic acid from diets, their cows are still going to be consuming C16 and still going to be putting about 30 to 32% of their butter fat as C16. So another very popular question this week is how can we maintain butter fat, or sorry, I should say, how can we maintain milk fat yield without C16 being added to the diet? And that would be what happens if we do take out Energizer. You know, how do we cope with this as a farm? Fortunately or unfortunately, it depends how you think about this, but ultimately you're going to have to milk 5 or 10% more cows. When I talk to some farmers, they just accept the fact that, you know, they will milk 5 or 10% more cows to meet their quota. But when I talk to other farmers, they say, well, 5 to 10% more cows means a lot more forages and grains, labor, more semen, more hoof trimming, more time milking, more dry offs, more treatments, more hoof trimming, things like that. So, you know, generally, I think that where our industry recognizes that, you know, the Canadian dairy farmers are very progressive. I think everybody recognizes that the goal is to maximize health and milk yield of the individual cow so that we can be more efficient. I don't think anybody wants to go back to what we were producing 30 years ago, where we'd have to have 2.5 to 3 times more cow on a farm to meet quota. I think if we look at the advances that we've made in nutrition and management, keeping cows super comfortable over the past 2 decades, especially, I don't think we want to give up these tools that improve efficiency of cows. And by taking away C16, that's one of the tools that we have to improve efficiency of our farms and of our cows. So now what we can do in the absence of these products is focus on just some of the, you know, obviously the basic management. And this is stuff that me and Amber focus on already on a daily basis when we visit farms. It's like the things that improve feed intake. And that's a whole different webinar, improving feed intake. And Trevor DeVries talks about that a lot as well. But there's different management aspects we can look at to improve the TMR intake. So for example, if our cow's eating 25 kgs of TMR today, how do we get her to consume how do we help her consume 27 kgs? Because that's what we'd have to have her do to make up that difference in dietary intake. If we were to remove the fats, then we'd have to look at many things on the farm. So that should be looked at already, whether or not we feed C16 or not. Good management practices. We can increase the diet energy, for example, just add more corn or more starch to the diet, in some cases barley or wheat, depending where you're at. We can add higher fat sources from other means, tallow, soybeans, cottonseed, for example. We can grow forages that are higher in digestibility. All right, I think many of us recognize that a higher digestibility forage, in other words, one that's cut young versus overly mature, will give a better butterfat yield per cow because it can simply consume so much more of that forage than if it was cut at a mature stage. And it's the same argument for BMR versus conventional corn silage, where if we focus on using forages with high digestibility, then it's a very strong way to improve the dietary energy and the intake, and therefore the production per cow and the health per cow when you can have that cow consuming more forage. Number one is health per cow. Improving the protein quality of that diet. And again, these are things that we've been looking at for many, many years, but we should recognize these are tools now to improve butterfat yield. We can feed things like methionine, and there's several sources of methionine, where we can improve the protein quality of that diet. And that's something we do with our formulation model, and that many other feed company representatives would also be able to talk to you about. So again, follow up after the presentation if you want to talk about any more of this specific list. So thank you for everybody attending, by the way. I'm not done yet, but I see there's 61 participants on there now, and that's awesome. It's a topic that's been very, I think, engaging for myself, but also the dairy farmers. What are the alternatives to palm? Well, I guess I'll be blunt. There isn't a good alternative to palm. And when I say palm, again, we don't feed palm oil to cows. What are the alternatives to feeding palmitic acid supplements, or the alternatives to feeding calcium salts like Magalac or something like that? Really, so what I did show here in this slide is what the requirement of a high production cow is. She needs about 1.80 megacal per kg of TMR intake. So that's generally, we need a fat percent in that diet of 5 to 7%, and about 25 to 28% starch or sugar to get the energy to that level. And we also need excellent quality forages to get to that level as well. And that's what stimulates these high levels of production, because the cows become very healthy when they consume a diet that's based on heavy amounts of high quality forage, and then the right amount of grains and fats. So the Energizer RP10 is clearly it has a big energy contribution. It's shown to increase milk a little bit, and butterfat quite a bit. Now here are the alternatives. Tallow. And I know a lot of people are probably shaking their head right now saying, well, we've worked the past 10 years to remove tallow from diets, and now it's suddenly becoming maybe a tool that we have to reach out to again to improve the energy density of our diets. And I don't, everybody's going to have a different stance on that, but I'll tell you, at Scothorn Nutrition, 100% of our diets are free of tallow. I mean, we don't, or animal byproducts. I mean, we don't feed any animal byproducts because that's what the consumers were concerned about 10 to 20 years ago. And that's what producers care about now. So hopefully the removal of palmitic acid products is not going to lead to heavier use of tallow, but it may. Cottonseed is very high in oil. Roasted soybeans, expeller soybean meal, all very high in fats and can be a contribution. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these oily products do not really give a butterfat response. And unfortunately, many of them tend to give a small protein percentage drop, milk protein, which may help you if you have to try to tuck your SNF to butterfat ratio under 2.2. However, if we're not getting a butterfat response at the same time, then it's going to be pretty challenging. So. One of the things that we used to feed back 20 years ago, when we actually strived to have low butterfat production per cow, was a lot of this soybean products that were finely ground, roasted, and had a lot of free oils in it. So one thing we recognize is that if you feed too much soybean oil to a cow that's not in a whole roasted bean, or that's in a free oil state, it can lead to a milk fat depression. That's one of the tools we used back 20 years ago. So we have to use all that knowledge that we used at one point when we go to replace Energizer in the diets now.
Daniel, just before you go on, there's a comment from Silvio that you might want to address in the chat.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Amber. Yeah. Dr. Miranda, keep in mind that in the last 5 years, industry have been adding palm oil to the tallow. That's a very good point. Yeah. Okay, so that's maybe something to consider if you are considering turning to so-called tallow, that they do need to sometimes adjust the fluidity of it, or even they may even be intentionally doing that to change the fatty acid profile. I'm not really sure. Yeah. Lee says, DFC asks us to consider alternatives to palm supplements. They never actually ask us to stop. Yeah, that is my interpretation as well, Lee. Thank you for clarifying that. So just quickly on this slide here, hey, it's going to look like an advertisement, isn't it? But I'm just trying to present the facts on this stuff. When cows go up and down in milk fat through the season, our biggest challenge that you're going to find without using supplemental fat products is trying to keep that butter fat high through the summer heat stress, which seems to be worsening each summer. Now, one of the best things we found to control summer heat stress and prevent that big butterfat reduction is having a really good heat abatement system, or a really good cooling and ventilation system in your barn. So this might be the year to really take that, pull the trigger and make that investment in good ventilation, because of all things we see, heat and barn cooling and ventilation are one of the biggest impacts on preventing that milk fat drop in the summer months. So there's lots of strategies that we know of to improve butter fat, and these are all classic things we've been working with for over 20 years now. We want to maximize fiber intake, and we don't want to maximize the intake of those really coarse, high fiber, low digestibility forages like straw or mature grass hay that's fine chopped. Those are all things that have very low NDF digestibility. Yeah, we have to have a certain amount of that UNDF or undigested NDF in a diet of the cow. However, we want to primarily maximize the use of these highly digestible forages, like excellent quality corn silage that's chopped at the right dry matter maturity. Ideally, BMR corn silage. I love that stuff. And considering the use of heavy amounts of grass, if possible, if you're in an area that can grow grass. I know there's a lot of people from Ontario on this call right now, so you may be more of an alfalfa area, but considering also a low lignin alfalfa that like the Harv Extra, if you can put that into your rotation. There's many ways. Personally, and I think many feed guys would say this, and other nutritionists, we want to minimize the use of straw in coarse hay if possible. We only want to have that in there to meet a certain amount of that coarse fiber that the cow needs, in case our forages are just too excellent, in case you're doing too good of a job producing these forages. We get a limited dietary antagonist. So I think we all know, probably a lot of us have been through this 20 years ago, that when we feed too many distiller grains or oily feeds, because they're so high in unsaturated fats, that can give us a milk fat depression, especially in the summer months when there's heat stress. And then adding dietary promoters. So there's a list of feed additives that you can consider, but specifically, obviously this Energizer 10 I put on there. It's an old slide, but the use of buffers. So here's a little more on. There's probably a number of other feed additives we could add to this slide, but essentially we want things that improve the rumen, that help the rumen stay healthy and at a moderate pH. So because when we're at the right level of pH in that rumen, not too many acids, that cow is going to maintain a good butter fat. And that's because she's not producing any of those nasty trans fatty acids that end up corrupting the de novo fatty acid synthesis, or in other words, it actually makes the fatty acid synthesis go lower into the udder because there's too many acids in that rumen. Now, and that's why we got to continue to feed the right amount of starch, the right amount of sugar, and the right amount of NDF in our diets to avoid those milk fat depressions. So some of these buffers, sodium bicarb, in most cases always include that, especially if you have a wet forage diet. Doesn't cost that much. Potassium carbonate comes with a little bit more sticker shock. It tends to be used in order to get potassium up in the diets. And when we, Dr. Weiss yesterday on his presentation from Ohio State, he said if we're feeding heavy amounts of potassium, always to increase the magnesium at the same time. But that certainly helps with butterfat, although it is not cheap. Yeast, many different types of yeast are shown to improve intake, and which therefore will help improve fat yield per cow. And this is one of the little things that I've taken a lot of interest in over the past number of years, although it's still not widely used, is this rumen protected methionine. There's many different forms out there. One of my favorites is just the smartamine, which unfortunately is also the most expensive one. But it seems to work well for giving a somewhat of a milk fat response, but also a milk protein response too. And it seems to pay for itself, but it is quite expensive. There's payback, but it's not a massive payback. To conclude this presentation, I want to keep it under an hour. So with a little blurb on how we can help consumers understand, I think we have to recognize that consumers are going to make the decisions based on a lot of different information. And I think that as a dairy industry, we have to stay really positive in our messaging. I don't think it's, again, I don't want to be too opinionated here. However, I think if we're negative and we're arguing with the professor, and if we're trying to always be putting down others people's opinions and thoughts, I don't know if that's the right way to take it. I think it's better to maybe ignore those negative opinions and talk about things that we're really proud of in our industry, and that is the good cow care, excellent cow comfort, and the healthy diets that we feed our cows. All you guys on this call, you're dairy farmers, and you feed the milk to your children, your family. You probably consume it to yourselves. So I already know you guys are all proud of what we feed our cows, but it helps. It really helps to tell the public how proud we are of the things that we're doing well, which are giving cows excellent comfort, excellent feeds. And this is an example that was posted on February 24th by Lori Veru, which is Lori owns Sunny Point Farms in Nova Scotia, one of the top production herds in Canada. And they took a very positive stance. They demonstrated on the tablecloth what they're feeding that cow. And this is pride. Now, they got lots of excellent feedback, so much feedback that they're asked 2 days later to interview on global national news. And this is a type of good news story I think that I think we should all try to be a part of. Is try to demonstrate to consumers how proud we are of what we do, and how we have 100% faith in what we do. So I'm going to conclude it there. I want to just thank you all for coming on, and I'm just going to go through this chat window here to see if there's some more comments and questions. There's lots there. Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you, Silvio. Appreciate it.
I think if people want to unmute themselves and ask any questions too, this would be the time if they'd like to.
Amber, since you're unmuted, you probably have one or two questions on your mind that that I may have missed or that people have been asking over the past few days?
No, I think it's pretty, you covered a lot of this information here. It's just about awareness. I know there's a lot of concerns on both sides from producers, and at this point, we really just have to kind of follow with a united voice, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
You have Brian here too, by the way. If you
Oh,
want.
hey, Brian. Yeah, actually,
Hey, Daniel. Great presentation. I think the biggest thing I'd like to echo, Daniel, is exactly what you said, that, you know, we hear a lot in the background of, you know, farmers kind of calling out other farmers for what they feed or whatever. And I think we need to maintain the positivity in our industry and realize that we're all in the same business for the same reason, and we want to look after our cows to the best, and nobody's feeding anything that is, you know, a bad feed that we weren't supposed to feed or whatever. And I think one of the things that really I think is important is that we take a stance on that and don't just cave and say, you know, well, we're gonna take this out because, you know, of what one person started on Facebook or whatever. It needs to be science-based, and we need to be united in that approach. Because if we just cave to opinion, you know, what's next? And that scares me a lot. I think, you know, and I think it's very, very important that we don't just cave to an opinion, that we continue on the path of doing what we know is, you know, scientifically based and sustainable and good and healthy for our cows to produce a great product.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And somebody else echoed that exact point, Brian. And by the way, this is Brian Craswell that was just speaking there, just in case you weren't sure which Brian it was. So somebody said the other day, well, you know, I feed my cows barley, so is that going to be perceived by the public as making the milk problematic with gluten for gluten intolerant people? I think that's probably a very simple take on. I'm sure that would never. You know, I got a lot more faith that the general public would know the difference. But I mean, it's just an example of you know, like it's really important to tell people how happy and proud we are of what we feed our cows. And it's anyways, it's that those misconceptions and conceptions are important to recognize for sure. So, yeah. I wonder if there's somebody else there from Newfoundland. I haven't heard from any Newfoundlanders, but if anybody wants to unmute their mic and give some comments about your perspective or question around that. See, Mr.
Daniel, Pauline just wrote about what's the sense that dairy farmers are intended to follow DFC's directive. And just to touch on that, like the reason why we created, this is a second webinar that we did this is because, you know, when those reports came out last week, there's a lot of calls, a lot of questions, and just a lot of, I mean, even answers we didn't have. So that was the intent, is just to kind of give the information. And then it really comes down to the dairy producer on their specific choice. I mean, DFC says to look at alternatives, and it is a farm specific question.
Yeah, that's well, I think well answered, Amber. Yeah.
Daniel, this is Lee. Thanks for the presentation. I really appreciated it.
Oh, hey, Lee, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I had several opportunities to have presentations by you and our farm over the years, and they're always informative, and you have the research to back it up. Sometimes I wonder when, so we got this food professor, so-called food professor, putting negative things about dairy on the, you know, Twitter and social media. If we had a couple of slides that showed that this is sustainable and shows that it's not a problem feeding it to our cows, it's very quick, consolidated, and to the point for consumers to see that we can pin to some of his social media attacks on supply management, because that's exactly what it was. He's not attacking butter hardness, he's attacking supply management. If anybody read the article, they could see that. But then if we had a couple of slides or very short, informative little things that we can quickly attach to it, especially to the people that's younger generation than me that can actually pin stuff to Twitter a little bit easier than I can, to help stop some of the misinformation that he's spreading. It may be helpful, and I don't know what anybody else thinks about that, but I sort of get really insulted when I see somebody like that attacking something, some way. They're attacking supply management. They're using other tools to do it, and it's outright lies. This is a sustainable product, and it's a good product to be feeding our cows. I guess that.
Well, that's one of the things I was,
Thanks, Dan.
You're welcome. Yeah, Lee, thanks. And I still recognize you as a young producer. Like when I met you 20 years ago when I first started to come to Newfoundland. So there's, I think that, I believe even in our own sector, there's maybe just a lack of knowledge around what these feeds are as well. And that's sort of the purpose. And, I'm probably 10 years behind doing presentations like this to help people understand what these palm derived co-products are. But I'm happy to do it now, and I'm trying to do as many as possible. But one thing I will say about the professor is that, and the only thing that I agree with him on is that he does actually in every interview say that he has no science to back this up. So he says that, almost in every interview I've heard him say is that, we don't have, I don't have any science on this, but it should be researched because it could be causing harm. It could be, palm could be bad. It could be blah, 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 right? So that's what people hear is what it could be. They may miss a point when he says, I don't have any science to back this up. He just says, a lot of people have been telling me that butter's hard. A lot, like 300 people on Twitter. That's a lot. Can be a lot. Is it a lot? I'm not sure. It's 35 million Canadians, right? 300 people saying butter's hard and 300 people saying that butter's not hard. They haven't noticed a difference. Well, that means that nothing's different, right? Butter's not harder. 50% of people say that it's not harder. 50% people say they haven't noticed. So, that's the type of, but that type of information in our culture is just fine to talk about because it's still interesting for people to hear. But you're right, there is no science here. And, I've certainly personally written to the professor, asked him to spend some time together so I can explain to him how we do diets to know. I don't think he has a lot of interest in learning how we formulate diets though, so that there's been no response. So there is a lot of take homes on this. There is an excellent podcast that was done on, I believe, Saturday or Sunday. And you can reach out to me afterwards. I'll send a copy of it to you, but it was done by Daniel Lafay from Valacta, and also by I can't remember her name, unfortunately, but she's a food marketer, and they have some really good points on this Buttergate conversation. So if anybody's interested, just reach out to me. Like Brian had a question back. He asked, "What's the return on investment in Energizer?" And I'll give that a quick answer. It's probably about 2 to 1, depending on your butterfat price and which province you're in. But the point of this is not to advertise RP10. I'm just trying to get some facts out on how this stuff is made, and what the how we can respond as producers to deal with this. So. I think it's probably a good place to conclude. There's couple more comments came in here. they said that, Natasha says, I think that's a great idea, Lee, what you said, Lee. I really think we need to focus on showing how sustainable the industry is, because this seems to be a real consumer concern. For sure, Natasha. And that's one of the things I think we have to weigh out as global citizens is, where do we want, how do we want to produce our food, and where, for example, if it just simply comes down to producing, the most environmentally source of oil, then in my mind, it makes sense to retrieve oil from the most productive crops, the type of oil that uses the least amount of land. So the other thing we have to consider in this whole, this one thing to consider, I think personally, but we also, I'm a hypocrite. I'm the first person to talk about what somebody in another country is doing. I may be also a person that at one point said, what are these people doing growing palm where there could be rainforest growing? But we do have to look at ourselves too. I think we certainly can't brag about the amount of forest and ecosystem on the Canadian prairies, and that's all our own doing. So I think we have to balance all these different perspectives when we consider the whole sustainability and environmental perspective. Does it make sense to go to more soil and less palm oil? Well, it depends what you think. I mean, it's going to support our local industry. When I look over here at the Grand Prairie Dike, probably about 20% of those fields are soybeans. I don't want to see that go. That's all beautiful farmland. It's being fed to chickens and pigs right in my backyard. But the other thing is, though, there's also deforestation in Brazil that's related to more production of soybeans. So we need to consider everything when we look at sustainability and environmental influence that we as humans have on the planet. And I think that we certainly have to focus on what gives us the most efficiency per acre, so that we don't have to use the entire land base of the earth to produce crops. So Pauline says, a pure economist will never embrace supply management. That's solely what the food professor is. Yeah, I think that's very well said, Pauline. Sheldon says, can you send me the link to the post from the misinformed critic? You have to not really sure which one you mean, Sheldon. You just let me know after. And James says, I think we need to hold our boards accountable for how this was handled. So, yeah. Well, I mean, we certainly have people on the boards on this call right now, and I think everybody probably has a different take on how this can or should be handled. But I've heard similar comments, James, is what you just said, for sure. So. Okay, I think that's an excellent place to conclude. Thank you very much, everybody. And there is a recording. You can reach out to myself or Amber. It's I didn't put it in the presentation, but my phone number is 902-692-1447. If you want to reach out on anything, you can text or phone me. It's 902-692-1447. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that if we manage this correctly, then we get through this. And you guys are a strong industry. You know how to deal with adversity. You do that every year when you plant your crops and harvest. So I got full faith that we're going to come through this with success. So thank you for your support over the past decade on this specific line of products. And I really appreciate everybody coming on today.